What's up, you scholars of enlightenment? Dr. Sam Gregson, particle physicist here again. I hope you're having a fantastic week. Now, today, we're going to be discussing an incredibly intricate measurement from the CMS collaboration at CERN, a measurement of the W boson's mass. Ever since the W boson was discovered at CERN 4 decades ago, successive collider experiments have pinned down its mass to increasing levels of precision. The W boson mass is a clear prediction of the standard model. To first order, it depends only on the mass of the Z boson and the value of the weak mixing angle. But higher order corrections introduce an additional dependence on the masses and couplings of other standard model particles, and in particular, the mass of the heavy top quark and the mass of the Higgs boson. As such, the mass of the W boson provides a vital test of the standard model's internal consistency. In early 2022, CDF, an experiment at the now decommissioned Fermilab Tevatron, released a result that shocked the particle physics community. CDF provided the most precise measurement of the W boson mass to date, and their measurement stood 7 sigma from the standard model prediction. This threw the internal consistency of the standard model up in the air, upset decades of steady convergence between experiment and theory, and potentially pointed to the existence of new, beyond standard model physics. Now, the LHC experiments have quite literally weighed in on the matter of the W boson mass. And just 1 week ago, CMS released their measurement of the W mass. Today, we will discuss that result. To help us understand how CMS made their measurement of the W boson mass, why that measurement is so important, exactly what they found, and where the standard model now sits, I'm joined by a phenomenal special guest, Professor Joshua Bendavid. Professor Bendavid is a particle physicist at MIT and a member of the CMS collaboration at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. Professor Bendavid's work focuses on many areas, including continuing measurement of the Higgs boson's properties with increasing precision, physics performance studies for the upcoming high luminosity phase of the LHC, and machine learning techniques for physics analysis and simulated data generation. He was also part of the team that recently measured the mass of the W boson using CMS data, and even presented the results on behalf of the CMS collaboration in a seminar at CERN last week. So who better to help us understand the current status of the W boson's mass? So, Josh, for people who are out there who might not know what the W boson is, let's start right at the top. What is the W boson?
So the W boson is a fundamental particle, and it's one of the carriers of the weak nuclear force, which is one of the fundamental forces of nature. It's actually closely related to the photon, which is the carrier of electromagnetism. And so in some sense, you can think of this as the sort of heavier cousin of the photon.
So this was something that was discovered in 1981 at the UA1 experiment at the SPS at CERN. Won a Nobel Prize for Carlo Rubio and Simon Vandermeer. But why should a layperson care about the W boson? Why is it so important in our everyday life?
Well, the W itself and the weak nuclear force that it mediates is essential to radioactive decay. It's actually a critical step in the fusion process that allows the sun to shine. So it's important in that sense. And also for various medical treatments, isotopes that are used for diagnostic tests, etc. That's critical. It's critical to understanding that. I think what I would say in general is that we do fundamental research for the sake of understanding how the universe works, but also being mindful that all technological developments build on top of a fundamental understanding of science underneath. And so, direct practical applications related specifically to this physics might be, decades or centuries away. Yeah. But if we don't do this physics now, we won't be able to get there. And an example I like to give is the electron, which is also a fundamental particle, and it was discovered in the 1890s. The physicists who did that could not have imagined, for example, modern electronics.
Yeah.
But modern electronics depends on our knowledge of the electron as a fundamental particle and its properties.
Yeah.
And of course, that didn't happen until some 50, 60, 70 years later. So we need to do fundamental science for the sake of it, first of all, but also as the basis for technological development in the future. Let's say.
Exactly right. I couldn't have said it better. That's a fantastic message for everyone out there. So moving more specifically into the W boson mass measurement, which is the focus of today's discussion, why is the W boson mass specifically so incredibly important in physics? Why is it something that we really want to nail down with absolute precision?
So our best theory for how matter and energy behave at subatomic scales is something called the Standard Model. And it describes the fundamental forces, the particles and their interactions. And the W is a critical component of the Standard Model. And although its mass is not directly predicted, what the Standard Model does do is it predicts very precisely the relationship between several of the key parameters of the Standard Model: the mass of the W, the mass of the Z, the weak mixing angle, which controls the sort of electroweak interaction, and then with corrections that enter from heavier particles, the top and the Higgs. And so what we can do is, by measuring all of those parameters very precisely, we can then turn that into a very precise, very stringent consistency test of the Standard.
Yeah.
And we know the Standard Model is incomplete because it doesn't describe, dark matter, dark energy, neutrino masses, and a number of other things. But we've never directly seen it break in our experiments. Yeah. And so the goal here is to measure all of the relevant parameters as precisely as possible and then test the consistency. The W mass, being one of the more difficult of those parameters to measure, is the one which is effectively least precisely known. And that is the motivation to measure it more precisely.
And we're going to get onto some of the reasons why that's so difficult. So essentially, we have a mass of the Higgs now. We have a mass of the Z, for example. We have an idea of the measurement of the weak mixing angle. But if we come from all these different directions, all of these measurements should line up. Two should predict another one. The other two should predict the other one in reverse. And they should all line up and come together correctly. And if they don't, then we have a problem, right? We have a problem in our standard model, and that means potentially beyond standard model physics, particles, forces could be at play. So like you say, we've never seen it break, but if one of these relationships doesn't hold, then that would be an example of it breaking. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So I want to just kind of highlight a little bit before we go into the specific measurement by CMS of the W mass. Why was this measurement from CMS and the measurements from the LHC experiments of the W mass more widely? Why were they so eagerly awaited? Maybe if we talk a little bit about what CDF said a couple of years ago.
Up until now, the most precise measurement of the W mass has been the measurement from the CDF collaboration, which was released in 2022. That measurement was done at the Tevatron, an accelerator in the United States, which is no longer operating, but which was the largest accelerator in the world prior to the start of the LHC. That measurement was 7 standard deviations away from the Standard Model expectation.
Yeah.
So to put in perspective, what that means is that the probability that could happen just as a result of a statistical fluctuation or a fluke is basically zero.
I've got a nice diagram up here for people to see of the CDF, the little blue box, which is way, way, way off to the right compared to previous measurements of the W mass, which all seem to, within error or almost as close as damn it within error, line up with the Standard Model expectation. But CDF, they said something that is very far off to the right there.
That's right, and so what that means is that either the Standard Model is wrong, and this is one of the first examples where we see it breaking, or there's a misunderstanding, more or less subtle, in how the theoretical predictions of the Standard Model are interfaced into the measurement.
Yeah.
Or of course, it's always possible that there's a mistake. One of the best ways to help disentangle the situation when these sort of tensions or outliers arise is always new measurements done as independently as possible.
Yeah, and I guess we can hark back there with the discovery of the Higgs. We obviously have Atlas and CMS both doing this measurements. When both see this thing, we can be more confident that we have discovered this new particle in 2012. Similarly here, if somebody's measuring something that's way off from the standard model expectation, we would like to see that repeated in other experiments with different methodologies. Is that fair, Josh?
Yes.
Awesome. Right. So we get to CMS actually going to measure this W boson mass. I guess if we start first, how do we produce W bosons at an experiment like CMS at the Large Hadron Collider? What's the production mechanism for these Ws?
Yeah. So the LHC is a proton-proton collider. But of course, the actual fundamental interactions which produce new particles in the collisions are interactions between the quarks and gluons inside the proton.
Yeah.
So the most likely interaction which produces a W is an interaction of a quark and an antiquark.
Yeah.
And then that produces the W at the collision point. And of course, the way that the LHC and the experiments are set up is that those collisions occur more or less in the center of our cylindrical detectors.
Yeah. And in this case, you talked about an antiquark. Some people might be a little bit confused. We're smashing two protons together here, but I guess this is the proton is much more complicated than just the three quarks underneath that we think of, right?
Yeah, that's right. So in the sort of very simple picture of the proton, it's composed of two up quarks and a down quark, and those are what we call the valence quarks. But then there is also a sea of quarks, which is created by sort of virtual pairs of quarks and antiquarks that are created for a very short amount of time and then immediately disappear. That's also true of gluons. And when protons are collided at high energies, those virtual particles, which sort of exist ephemerally, can also participate in the collisions.
Excellent.
And so that's what's happening when we produce a W at the LHC. There is an antiquark that is produced by such means, one way or another.
Brilliant. So by smashing these protons together, we can generate plenty of these Ws. How with the CMS measurement, how did we go about isolating a clean sample of these Ws for study? Because obviously you've got a hell of a lot of interactions going on in the LHC, lots of different things being produced. Is it easy to isolate a clean sample of these Ws? Do we look at a particular decay chain, for example?
Yeah. So in order to answer that question, the first thing to understand is that a W is very, very short-lived. So yeah. It's produced in the interaction, and then it pretty much immediately decays.
Yeah.
And it decays in a few different ways. The decay channel that we're interested in at the LHC is the so-called leptonic decay, where the W decays to a charged lepton and a neutrino.
Yeah.
The reason for that is that at the LHC, there's a very, very, very high cross-section or probability for interactions that produce strongly coupled particles. And QCD, or the strong nuclear force, if you like, is strong. And so that would sort of overwhelm everything else. But in order to produce a charged lepton or a neutrino at the LHC, you need something that proceeds through the weak interaction, and that is weaker, and therefore those types of collisions are much less probable, and that is the sort of basic feature which allows us to isolate a sample of W events, where essentially we look for events where there's a charged lepton, a single charged lepton, and a neutrino. We cannot detect the neutrino directly because it's too weakly interacting. So when a neutrino is produced in an LHC collision, it basically just sails clean through our detector and doesn't interact. But we can infer its presence by something called missing energy, where basically when the protons collide, in principle, they produce particles, but the particles should be sort of balanced in their momentum in the direction away from the beam. And so what we do is we sort of measure everything in the event and we add it up. Yeah. And then if it doesn't add up, then the missing part is referred to as missing energy, and it is a proxy for the momentum of the neutrino that we couldn't measure.
So when we're looking for these W's, I guess we're looking for a muon, an electron, a tau, for example, which is kind of isolated, a nice clean track of that, as we can see in this diagram here, and some missing energy as well in the collision, and that would suggest that we had this W that decayed to a lepton and a neutrino. Is that fair?
Yes, that's right. Taus are a bit more complicated, but yes, for the electron and muon case, that's right.
I think in this analysis, Josh, did you focus specifically on the muons? I think it said somewhere in your talk that there was a decision made to not deal with the electrons, not deal with the taus, but deal with the muons, potentially easier to see, easier to understand the systematics downstream. Is it the W to muon and neutrino that we're more interested in with this measurement?
Yes, that's right. That was the focus of our measurement. So previous measurements at Hadron Colliders have considered also the electrons. We made a decision for a couple of reasons to focus on the muons. One of the reasons is that historically, one of the reasons you would want to use the electrons is that gives you a factor of 2 more W's than if you only use the muons. But we're actually using a very large data set. This is the largest data set which has ever been used for a W mass measurement. And so in some sense, we're not so worried about the statistics because we have more than enough W's just in the muons. Also, this data was collected at somewhat higher pileup than was used for some of the previous measurements. So pileup refers to when the protons collide, there are actually bunches of protons, and there are many protons there. And so it's not just one pair of protons which collide, but it's actually many.
Yeah.
In the present LHC collisions, we have about 60 simultaneous interactions per crossing. In the data which we used for this measurement, it's about 30.
Yeah.
And that's enough that it produces quite a lot of additional particles and activity in the event that make it more difficult to measure the missing energy that's related to the measurement of the neutrino, but also to some extent the electrons. The muons are relatively less affected by that, and that was one of the reasons we decided.
Okay. So we want a nice clean data set, and I guess that's kind of almost what defines a difficult measurement, right? When your systematics are becoming more important than your statistical errors, then we're really focusing here on driving down those systematics, getting a nice clean data set. So it makes sense to focus on those muons. So going into this particular measurement, most people might be familiar with something like reconstructing the mass of the Z from two muons. That's a relatively simple thing to do. Why is it so difficult to reconstruct the mass of the W by contrast? Why is this a measurement that's taken 10 years, whereas reconstructing the mass of the Z seems to be something you give to a student as their first activity in a PhD or even an undergrad lesson?
Well, it's all just down to the fact that the neutrino cannot be directly measured in the detector. Yeah. So we are effectively trying to reconstruct the W with only half of the picture.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it difficult. So the way that this works is that the momentum of the muon is closely related to the mass of the W, but it's also closely related to the momentum of the W.
Yeah.
And so in order to properly make the connection between the mass of the W and the momentum distribution of the muon, you need to know the momentum distribution of the W and also some other more subtle things related to its spin. And predicting that accurately and interfacing that in a consistent way into the measurement is a significant challenge.
So just to give people a little bit of an idea out there as to why this is so difficult. So if we have something like the Z that decays to two muons, we can measure the energy and momentum of those two muons. We can trace them back. We can find the mass essentially of the Z boson. And that's a very easy thing that we can do. We have those two, we join them together, we create an invariant mass distribution, bang, we have the mass of the Z. But as Josh just said, with the W, we're missing half of the event. We have this muon, but we don't have the neutrino. So instead of going backwards, projecting backwards and trying to get the mass of this W, we're obligated to go forwards from the messy proton collision all the way through to find the momentum of the W and then work forward and try to work out what's going on, essentially from first principles. Is that fair, Josh?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. But it should also be said that a key part of those predictions is understanding, because it's the quarks and gluons inside the proton which actually interact.
Yeah.
One has to understand the distribution of quarks and gluons within the proton.
Yeah.
And that is also something which cannot be calculated from first principles, simply because the strong interaction is very difficult.
Yes, this is an incredibly difficult measurement to get, and we're going to come on to some of those difficulties very shortly. So that brings us to the question you were just kind of winding up to cover it, is how on earth is this measurement actually done then? So we see with the Z, we have the measurement of the two muons. We can simply trace them back. We make an invariant mass plot. Bang, we've got the mass. So how does this measurement kind of proceed with the W? How do we go from those interacting quarks and work forward and then work out what the mass of the W is?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do as much as possible is to use our data to, at the same time as we're trying to measure the mass of the W, to also place constraints on some of those theoretical modeling uncertainties.
Yeah.
In order to reduce their effect on the final W measurement. So the way that this works is that we take the most advanced and accurate theoretical predictions that we can, including the model of the proton and how the quarks and gluons interact and so on and so forth. And as you said, we sort of feed that forward into a prediction for the distribution, the momentum distribution of the muons. We also run that through a very detailed detector simulation, which is kind of a detail, but also important in terms of modeling that aspect of things. And then what we do is we have this very fine-grained distribution of both the momentum, but also the direction of the muon, relative to the beam, which is also important. And also splitting by charge, because the W's come in two charges, W plus and W minus. The W plus decays to positively charged muons, and W minus decays to negatively charged muons. And in addition to, so what we do is we parameterize how the shape of that distribution would change under a variation of the W mass by 5 or 10 or 50 or 100 MeV.
Yep.
But then we also parameterize how that distribution would change under a small change in the distribution of quarks within the proton. So for example, if we say that there are a little bit more up quarks at high momentum fraction, how does that change the shape of the distribution? Or if we say that there's a little bit higher chance that additional gluons are sort of radiated off the back and give a bit more kick to the W, we also sort of propagate that through the predictions and keep track of how that would change the momentum distribution of the W. And we do that for all of the relevant, both theoretical and experimental uncertainties.
Yeah.
And then what we finally do is we take the entire distribution as we observe it in data, over a few thousand bins related to the momentum and direction of the muon. And we do what's called a maximum likelihood fit, where we find the most probable solution for the W mass on the one hand, but also all of the theoretical and experimental uncertainties on the other. And so the data, if you like, is so precise and so granular that in many respects it's able to disentangle the effect of a small change in the mass of the W versus a small change in the proton structure or a small change in how the W is produced in the collision.
Yeah.
And in that way we're able to both reduce the effects of those uncertainties on the W mass, but also make some determinations related to those things in their own right, which is also an interesting aspect of this measurement.
Yeah.
And the end result is that we get to, despite the very challenging environment and difficulties in theoretical predictions and so on, we managed to get to a very precise measurement of the W mass.
So to try and say that simply for people, so essentially we can work forward from our previous modeling, our previous assumptions, our previous data about the partons, the quarks and antiquarks that are inside the proton, to work out how much momentum and energy goes into the W. So we've got that W, which has a particular mass, it has a particular momentum as well, and then we can feed that forward with our theoretical understanding of the standard model into the momentum distributions of the W and then the muon. And then we can make these simulations. One of the examples I've got up on the screen, Josh, for example, of the muon momentum, the transverse momentum of the muon, and you can predict what that should be, but then you can rerun your simulations with different values of the W mass. So you can then see which W mass gives you all of these different distributions most accurately. And as Josh says, fit over a number of different distributions, taking into account uncertainties. And then the W mass essentially floats, and you can kind of lock in on what the data is telling you is the best, most likely value for that W mass, and therefore make the measurement. Is that a reasonable, simplified explanation, Josh?
Yeah, that's right. I should say though that you may wonder about the computational feasibility of all
Yes,
of this.
very much so.
And so what I can say is that we do not actually rerun the simulation from scratch for
Right.
different hypotheses of the W mass or of any of the other theoretical variations. But we use various computational tricks, if you like, in order to reuse the nominal simulated sample by reweighting the events, if you like, so that we can reuse them and save on computing power.
Excellent. Because I've got some numbers down here. 4 billion simulated events used for these W decays, and 100 million W candidates in data. So this is really a massive computational challenge as well, Josh. Right? If you're going to feed all of those distributions forward and compare these huge data sets.
Yeah, so for perspective, each of those simulated events takes about between 1 and 2 minutes on a single CPU to simulate. Now you can calculate that if you had only one CPU generating those 4 billion events, we wouldn't finish this measurement in 1 year or not even in 10 years. So of course, the way that we do this is that we have a lot of computing power at our disposal, tens or hundreds of thousands of CPU cores. But nevertheless, it would still be utterly unaffordable to regenerate those 4 billion events, even 5 or 10 times. So we really have to be clever about how we use them in order to do this in an efficient and manageable way.
And I know some of your work from looking at your resume is involved with machine learning and deep learning algorithms for faster generation of these simulated events. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. But that's still an R&D project to some extent. So that's not something which has been incorporated into the simulations used for this analysis.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that make this analysis so difficult. So you've already mentioned a few of them, but I guess for me, the kind of three biggest ones that kind of popped up was theory. So these parton distribution functions, the behavior that's going on inside the proton, backgrounds as well. So things that look like W's that might not be W's, and also understanding our detector. So making sure that this momentum distribution that we're trying to fit to is the real momentum distribution that is being produced by nature. So maybe if we start with, I think the one that you deal with the easiest, which is backgrounds. Are there any backgrounds in here where you get these W bosons, but you're not really seeing a W boson, you're seeing something else, and can that interfere with our result for the W mass?
Yeah. So the two largest sources of background are actually Z events, where a Z decays into two muons, but we only detect one of the two muons.
Okay.
You usually because the second muon goes outside of the detector coverage.
Yeah.
And so those events look quite similar to W events.
Yeah.
But they actually need to be controlled very precisely because, of course, the mass of the Z is about 10 GeV heavier than the W. So if we wouldn't account for those events properly, they would actually pull the value of the mass up.
Yeah.
Because they would look like sort of heavier W's, if you like. So those are very important to control. But fortunately, we have very good theoretical models for the Z. In fact, we use the same theoretical models for the Z as we use for the W because they're closely related. And then the second source of background is what we call non-prompt background. So what this means is that this means muons that are not produced by the primary interaction of the protons, but rather come from decays of other particles. And this is usually related to what we call B and D hadrons, which are hadrons that contain B and C quarks. And those quarks lead to decays that can produce muons. And so that's the other source of backgrounds. Those backgrounds can be distinguished to some extent by the fact that the muons, since they're not produced at the primary interaction, they're actually displaced. So if you actually look at where they point, they don't point exactly back to where the collision happened. They point slightly off to the side, and so we can distinguish them that way. But there are still some left afterwards, and we have to account for that. You can't get rid of all of them, but what you can do is you can make a prediction for how many should be there and what their shape should be, and this is an important part of the measure.
Brilliant. So we can minimize those as much as possible, and then we have good simulations as to how they might change our momentum distribution, which then affects the mass of the W. So we can deal with backgrounds. How about the parton distribution function? So you mentioned that when we're talking about a proton, obviously we're talking about lots of quarks and antiquarks kind of sloshing about inside there, and they're going to impact how much momentum the W gets and how much momentum ultimately these muons get. So how can we know precisely what's going on inside the proton? How do you approach that and work out how much momentum is being fed forward into the W? Are you just using the most up-to-date calculations? What's the process that goes on there?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, the distribution of quarks and gluons within the proton actually cannot be today calculated from first principles, simply because the calculation is too difficult in QC. So what's typically done is that theorists build empirical models for the structure of the proton, which are actually based on data. But not on our data to start with. The most important data set that goes into that is actually something called deep inelastic scattering, where you take electrons and you collide electrons with protons, and the electrons act as a sort of probe for the structure of the proton. And by looking at how those interactions behave, you can learn about the distribution of quarks and gluons inside the proton. So data from those experiments collected at other colliders and detectors has been used to construct this sort of model of the proton. And then in the intervening years, quite a lot of data from both the Tevatron and from the LHC and other experiments has also gone into these sort of global models of the proton. And so we use those models as a starting point, but we also carefully compare the effects of different models that come from different groups. And as I said, we try to set up our measurement in such a way that we constrain in situ with our own data set as much as possible the uncertainties related to the proton structure. One of the reasons we're able to do that is that if you think about the collisions, right, you have the colliding protons. The colliding protons have the same momentum. The one coming from the left has the same momentum as the one coming from the right. But the quarks which interact don't. And that's exactly what those uncertainties are on the distribution of quarks and gluons within the proton. And so if the quark that's going this way has more momentum than the one that's coming this way, then the W will actually be moving this way when it's produced, and vice versa. And so that has an effect on the muon momentum, and in particular the direction. So if the muon is going this way close to the beam or close to the center of the detector or the other way, that tells you quite a lot about what's been going on in the collisions. And so by splitting up the data in that way, it gives quite a bit of sensitivity to the parton distribution functions and helps us reduce those uncertainties quite a bit.
That makes sense. So just for people out there, so when you smash these protons together, it's almost like, I like to say it's like throwing two bags of potatoes at each other. Sometimes they smash head on the potatoes, sometimes they glance off, and you have to have an idea of, over a very large sample of smashing potatoes together, how much momentum are you going to get fed forward into your collision, and therefore how much momentum is going to go forward into this W and then into the muon. And this is what we're trying to understand. How much momentum will be fed into that collision over a large number of proton collisions. And for that, we need to understand what's going on inside the proton, how those quarks and antiquarks are kind of sloshing about inside there. And as Josh nicely told us, that has been a lot of work over a lot of years by a lot of different groups. And we feed that forward into this analysis and constrain it with the data in intelligent ways so that it has a minimal effect, or as minimal effect as we can, on our W boson mass. So those are more theory challenges, uncertainties. We talked about the backgrounds as well. What about the understanding of the detector? Because I guess if you're going to make these beautiful momentum distributions, for example, I'll bring up the momentum of the muon again. If you're going to predict a particular momentum distribution for these muons coming from the W, depending on the W mass, you better be damn sure that when you go measuring data that you're getting the actual momentum distribution of those muons correct with your detector. I guess there's a lot of things that can go wrong there, right, Josh? If you don't understand your momentum, if you don't understand your magnetic field, for example, or you have dead cells in your detector, or you don't know the exact position of all your detector cells. I guess you really need to understand your detector well as well, right? To make sure you're getting this momentum distribution correct in data.
Absolutely. So let me maybe explain briefly how we actually go about measuring the momentum of a charged particle in our detector. So the CMS detector is a cylinder, which is essentially built around the beams and the interaction point. And the entire inside of the detector is inside of a very large magnet, which means that there's a very strong magnetic field. And so when a charged particle, for example, a muon, is produced in the collision, it travels through the detector, but it's actually bending as it travels through the magnetic field, because the magnetic field bends the trajectory of a charged particle. And the degree to which it bends actually tells you what its momentum is. It tells you how fast it's going, because the higher the momentum, the straighter the muon. The lower the momentum, the more that it bends.
Yeah.
And so what we need to do to measure its momentum is we need to measure the radius of curvature effectively. And the way that we do that is that the inner parts of our detector are comprised of many thousands of silicon modules. So you can think of them, they're not so dissimilar from the chips, the imaging chips in a digital camera, for example, the camera in your cell phone. And what happens is when the charged particle passes through the sensor, it deposits some charge, which produces an electrical signal, which ultimately leads to a very precise measurement of its position as it passed through that sensor. And we have many layers of these. So you have the particle that goes through. So you have 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, 4 points, 5 points. Typically for a muon passing through our detector, in the inner detector, we'll get about 15 measurement points. And then we sort of connect the dots of those points. We draw out the sort of spiral path that the particle is expected to take. And we measure the radius of the curvature, and we use that to infer the momentum.
Yeah.
Now, in order to do that accurately, there's a few things that we need to know. We need to know exactly how strong the magnetic field is, which way it's pointing, and how that changes over the volume of the detector. We need to know exactly how much material is in the detector, because as the muons pass through, for example, a cable or a cooling pipe or a circuit board or even the silicon sensor itself, they lose a little bit of energy. And so their momentum is actually slowing. And so we actually have to take that into account, that the momentum, the curvature we measure over here has actually already been affected by a little bit of energy loss. And if we know how much, then we can properly account for that. And then the third thing which we have to deal with is what we call alignment. But what it really means is something quite basic. So when one of those sensors gives a signal, the sensor doesn't know where it is in three-dimensional space. It just says, hi, I'm sensor number 537. I've just produced a signal on channel number 832. And so we have a giant database that tells us where all of those sensors are, which way they're oriented, and actually even takes into account a little bit sort of bending or twisting, which can happen when things are assembled. And we use that to translate those measurements into a position. The tricky part is we actually need to know the positions and orientations of those modules to a precision of a few micrometers, which is a sort of small fraction of a width of a human hair. and that is a big challenge in its own right. And so, controlling all of those three aspects has been a major challenge in achieving the required accuracy for the reconstruction, the actual measurement of the muon momentum, which is, of course, just as important, as you said, as predicting it.
And this is starting to give people an idea of why this measurement at different colliders as well, with different collaborations, it seems to take a decade to make, because you really, really have to dial in on these issues. There's just no way around it. It takes a long time to understand all of these systematics, all of these effects, and disentangle everything, and hence it ends up taking a decade. I struggle to think of measurements that are more intricate or take a longer time. Maybe, I don't know if off the top of your head you can think of one, but this seems to be one of the most intricate measurements that I've ever come across.
From an experimental standpoint, I think that's right. I mean, you can also think of the muon G-2 measurements at Fermilab or Brookhaven, for example, which have actually related challenges. But yes, this is certainly one of the more difficult measurements in high energy physics from an experimental standpoint as well.
So that brings us to a question then, Josh. So obviously we've said how difficult this is. We said how long it takes. We said all of the systematics that can change the result. How can we be confident in the result that CMS has come up with? What kind of cross checks have they done to make sure that this methodology for calculating the W boson mass is accurate?
That's a very good question. So what we try to exploit is the fact that the Z boson is actually closely related to the W boson from a theoretical standpoint. But also its mass is relatively close to the W boson. And so when it decays into two muons, and those muons behave in the detector in almost the same way as the muons from the W. So what we do is we use the Z as a validation sample as much as possible.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of the things that we've done in this measurement, even a little bit more than in previous measurements, is to try to make the calibration of the experimental aspects rely on the Z as little as possible, so that we reserve it as a sort of final validation. Yep. But also for the theoretical modeling, we try to avoid pre-tuning the theory models to the Z data, in order that we can use then the Z data as a validation of the theory models.
So is that so you can measure the mass of the Z, something that we can also measure with a simple reconstruction, but you can use this W boson methodology for measuring the mass to also measure the mass of the Z and make sure you get a correct value that we know, quote unquote, is correct. Is that what we're going to do here?
That's right. So actually, the first thing we do is to do the simpler thing, which is to measure the mass of the Z using the direct reconstruction from the two muons, because that actually tells us that we've calibrated our muons correctly.
True. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Because the mass of the Z has been very precisely measured at previous experiments.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. But then, yes, once we've done that, in order to validate, in particular, the theoretical models, what we can do is we can take those Z events where we measure both muons, and we simply pretend that we didn't measure one of the muons.
Yeah.
We remove it and we treat it as if it were a neutrino. And of course, that's easy because a neutrino is not measured in the detector. So it's really easy to take something which you did measure and pretend that you didn't.
Yeah, so we throw one of the muons in the bin, and now it is essentially a neutrino. So okay, we're happy, right?
That's right. And then we go through as much as possible the very same methodology that we use to extract the W mass, including all of those theoretical modeling uncertainties that are propagated to the predictions for the momentum of the remaining muon. And we measure the Z mass by that means as well, and then check that we've gotten the right answer.
Yeah.
One thing I should also say is that for these types of precision measurements, it is absolutely critical to do the measurements in a manner which is blind, which means that we don't look at the answer until the analysis is completely done and finalized and has passed through some degree of internal review such that we all agree that it's final.
Yeah.
And the reason for that, of course, is to avoid subconsciously biasing ourselves.
Yeah.
And making changes to the methodology that produce a more or less preferred value. And so we've actually imposed that blinding strategy also for the Z validation steps. So we also didn't look at the measured Z mass in the course of that. And so that also increased the confidence that once we unblinded the Z component of those checks and got the right answer, consistent with known Z mass measured at previous experiments, that gave us a lot of confidence that the validation was meaningful.
Excellent. So we run exactly the same analysis techniques we do for the W with the Z, but just knocking out one of the muons. It gives us the correct value for the Z boson mass within errors consistent with the standard model and with previous experiments. That gives us a lot of confidence that when we apply a similar or essentially the same methodology to the W mass, then we should be getting the quote unquote correct result. So we can be fairly confident in our results. Excellent. Really, really good stuff. So let's talk about where this leaves us then, Josh. So the result from CMS, I've now got up the kind of comparison from LEP, D0, CDF, LHCb, Atlas, CMS, all these previous experiments that have made measurements of the W boson mass. Where does the CMS result come out, and where do you think that leaves us?
So yeah, the CMS result is very consistent with the standard model expectation, with a precision which is actually very close to the CDF one. It's consistent with all of the other previous measurements, but it is in fairly strong tension with the CDF measurement.
Yeah.
And so, one way to look at this is that the CMS result has sort of confirmed the standard model or confirmed the other measurements. Another way to look at it is that, as you said before, if one wants to claim a discovery of new physics, having at least two independent confirmations is sort of required before the field can accept that. And so if we had been in agreement with the CDF measurement, but in strong disagreement with the standard model, then that could have been taken as a sort of confirmation that this was a hint of new physics. And for better or for worse, that is not the case.
Yeah.
So now I think we're in a situation where it's much more likely that the standard model is correct in this respect. But of course, this doesn't actually explain the discrepancy with the CDF measurement, and that's something which will still have to be considered, whether there could be some more or less subtle theoretical misunderstanding in how theoretical predictions are applied to one measurement or the other. Also considering that the conditions are somewhat different. The tevatron is a proton-antiproton collider and at lower center of mass energies, so there are some issues which are different there. Although mostly going in the direction of things which are more difficult to model at the LHC. Or of course, there can still be a problem or mistake in one of the measurements, and perhaps this sort of confirmation of the standard model prediction and the other experiments on the one hand, and this remaining strong tension on the other, could spur a closer look or additional checks or other things in all collaborations to try to understand this better.
So for the moment, the communities, it's going to be very hard to suggest that the standard model isn't kind of holding up with all of these other measurements carefully aligned with the standard model and pretty much with each other. And as you said, there's strong tension with CDF. But as you also said, we still don't understand why this tension exists, and all of these collaborations need to go and have a look and understand why that is. Should we expect any update on any of these measurements in the near future? I don't know if CDF is still looking at this. I guess they are, to understand that tension. Do we expect any update from CDF or from CMS, or is this pretty much finalized on their sides?
So I can't speak for CDF, and also for CMS. I can't really definitively say what our plans are for the future.
Sure.
But you can sort of see that this measurement was performed with about 10% of the
Mm.
LHC run 2 data. So there's a lot more data which is available. And we haven't used directly as in previous measurements the missing energy distribution, for example. And we've introduced a lot of new techniques that are moving the experimental and theoretical basis for these measurements forward, but they can be moved further. There's still more work that can be done to improve things further. So I think at CMS it's certainly possible that the precision can be improved with future measurements, and so it could be that we have updated or more precise measurements in the future, let's say.
Excellent. And I've got one final question, Josh. So I've seen a few people pitching this as, the standard model wins again. Everyone's kind of miserable. We haven't got any beyond standard model physics here necessarily. Should people be disappointed that we haven't broken the standard model, or should we be happy and confident that the intricacy of this measurement has spurred so much good science, so better understanding of parton distribution functions, excellent mapping of detectors, new data generation techniques, new analysis techniques? Is there a positive message that you can put out from this that counters that idea that standard model wins again, everyone's miserable?
So I think what I would remind is that even before the CDF measurement in 2022, when there was no obvious tension here, it was already well motivated to measure the W mass more precisely. And the reason why is, of course, we want to test the standard model as precisely as possible. And so the standard model prediction has an uncertainty of about 6 MeV for the W mass. And the most precise experimental measurements have a precision of 9.4 or 9.9 MeV. And so it's still motivated to further improve the precision in order to actually make those stringent tests. And so one way that I would look at this is that our measurement, and with all of the advances in experimental and theoretical techniques and understanding, as you've said, demonstrates that we can do this actually at this level of precision. And so what I would say is that even if it turns out that the CDF measurement is an outlier or due to some misunderstanding or something else, we're still in an excellent position to now further improve the precision of these measurements, also in future colliders, and test the standard model to an even greater degree. So, just because there's no discrepancy from the standard model at the level of 60 or 70 MeV doesn't mean that there isn't one at the level of 5 or 6 or 3 MeV, and we still have the opportunity to sort of hone in on that.
So if the theory is saying, look, this is the mass of the W plus or minus 6, if we want to really nail down and see that that's correct, then we need to be getting below plus or minus 6. We need to be getting down to plus or minus 2, plus or minus 1, and this is a step towards getting there to checking that standard model prediction.
Absolutely. And of course, the standard model prediction will continue to get more precise as well, because that is actually dominated by the experimental uncertainties on the Z mass, weak mixing angle, top mass measurements. And those are also getting more precise as we go down. So I think there are very good prospects for these precision tests of the standard model going forward. And even if this particular one turns out not to be the sort of crack that breaks it open, it doesn't mean that there isn't one there to be found in the more or less distant future.
And we're working on all these techniques to find those cracks. I guess it's like that story of Tantalus, isn't it? We move forward, we get more accurate, and then the theorists move it back a little bit further. But we keep as long as we keep moving forward, we're going to be able to keep testing the standard model with more accuracy, and that's a very positive direction to be moving. Is that fair, Josh?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it.
Excellent. Right. Absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed that. I've learned an awful lot. Is there anywhere, just as we finish, Josh, thank you very much for taking the time today, that you'd like to direct people to learn more about this result, to learn more about what CMS are doing and where they're going to be going in the near future?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, certainly for other physicists, we have the physics analysis summary and the paper, which will be submitted soon.
Yeah.
There is a physics briefing which was posted from CMS about this measurement, and also that are regularly posted about a wide range of measurements that we're doing in the collaboration. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have any other more specific pointers.
That's okay, no problem. I'll make sure all of those links are down in the description, along with Josh's work, so you can follow what he's doing as well. Josh, I'd like to really thank you for going through this with me. I know you've obviously had a lot of work to do with this measurement and then presenting the measurement at CERN last week. And just before you go, I believe you're still working on the paper to submit it, right? So this is an ongoing process.
Yeah, that's right. But this has actually been a useful one because we've also been collecting feedback both from within the collaboration and from outside about the result and about sort of additional plots and information which are useful to include in the public material. So I think this has been a productive and constructive process as well, I'd say.
Brilliant. Josh, thank you so much again for taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy, and I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully when anything else comes up on this, we can get together and have another chat.
Yes, thank you, Sam.
Take care, buddy, and have a lovely evening.
Likewise.
I want to know what you think, because you're the scholars of enlightenment that I do this for. So please take a moment, if you wish, to let me know down in the comment section. And if you like this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, setting up notifications, and sharing this video more widely. I can't tell you how much these simple actions help me out and how much I'd appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being scientific. Thanks for being bad.